has there been study on learning and like language learning and psychedelics? Has anyone ever done that?
I'm not aware of that. Because everything just sort of stopped in 1970.
Yeah.
And
can you imagine what the world would have been like if it didn't? It would be real different. And I tell people, had LSD never been discovered, we can't even imagine what the world would be like. Think of its influence on art, performing art, music, psychedelics. I mean, I think their world would be a much different looking place. Yeah. I mean, you think of, one single course of action that had such dramatic negative impact, the criminalization and not only for what it's done to the people, but just the pure research alone, how far that set science back.
I mean, studying the brain, studying depression, mental illness, all this stuff is going to yield to this. And it's just started a couple of years ago, basically.
Yeah.
And when you realize the drug war was started to suppress Democratic voters, you knew that, right?
That's the theory that I heard,
John Ehrlichman supposedly was quoted as saying, we wanted to suppress the Democratic voters, but we couldn't just stop them from voting. But we knew they were all these young people were smoking pot and taking drugs. And so if we criminalized the drugs, we could lock them up and give them records and then they couldn't vote. Think, well, the drug war started as voter suppression? Like, that's really awful.
That's bad. Yeah, that's bad. And so many, you talk about even issues with marijuana and, there's ties back to William Randolph Hearst owning a bunch of paper resources and not wanting hemp.
He had all this forests for his paper industry, and he was afraid that hemp paper would make his forest worthless. And of course, hemp paper is better than paper made out of wood.
Yeah.
The U.S. Constitution is written on hemp paper. It's a renewable resource. Farmers could grow it. We could make fiber, renewable hemp, and it's a weed. I mean, I've grown a little bit before. It's a weed.
Yeah.
You can't hardly kill it.
Yeah.
So paper, fiber, seed is a lot of protein. Cannabis oil.
Yeah, we make hemp protein. Yeah, that's part of our business. Make hemp protein,
and they won't let them grow it.
I mean, you talk about like that is Bond supervillain type of move, really, where you just fuck all the consequences. I'm already incredibly rich, but I need to get more rich by eliminating I mean, it's so insane, that move.
Well, I live in a gated community. My wife likes it there because there's security. When she was in Brazil, she was in a very nice neighborhood, but she had an electrified fence, barbed wire fence around her house, and the neighbors all paid a guard to patrol with a gun up and down the streets. So when we were looking at houses, we went to this gated community, and she felt very secure. The problem is it's full of retired Republican millionaires. So
you're secure from everything outside of the gate.
Almost literally. And so you drive by these, and these are old. I'm retired. I'm 72, but you have people. I'm like one of the younger people in this community, and there's people all the way up to 90, and there are houses there that have 10 and 12,000 square feet.
Yeah,
2 floors, 3 floors, and you go, what in the hell does an old 80-year-old retired couple with no children, what do they need a 10,000 square foot house for?
Well, I'll tell you, Dave, because you got to show people that you're better than they are.
That's right. Exactly.
That's what you need that house for.
My dick is bigger than your dick, right?
Look how monstrous it is. Yeah. I had Stan Groff on the podcast recently, and he was talking about the old Cold War joke where they were saying, yeah, those Russian missiles are looking pretty hard. We got to make sure that our missiles are even harder. It's a crazy attribute of, human psyche when the ego is unchecked.
I had a student come to my office years ago, and she said, you know why I think psychedelics are illegal? Because the government knows if people take them, they'll see all the games they're playing, and they'll see what the government's doing, and they'll hate capitalism and all that. And I'll say, I don't know if there's anybody in the government smart enough to know that.
Yeah.
But there's probably some truth to that. I mean, my father was a really right-wing guy, and so all the hippies were using acid and smoking. He says, oh, those damn hippies, all these drugs are turning them against America. And so there was that perception among that crowd that the drugs made them turn into traitors. They didn't want to fight the wars and stuff. And maybe they did. I don't know. That's a good thing.
Yeah. It's interesting when you play that, because I think so much of this is people trapped in their own ignorance. Like this idea of this evil mastermind that knows all of the truth and then is restricting it. I don't really buy that either. I think they're just locked in their own prisons of fear anyways, because I've watched people approach any of these things, even a flotation tank, which holds up that mirror where you get a chance to look at yourself for once with at least some of your biases gone, which of course psychedelics are typically even stronger. And that's a really scary thought if you haven't done that for years. You're afraid of what you might see. And I think so often people just criminalize those things that they're afraid of. Oh, I'm afraid of that thing, so let's just take it off the game board entirely.
They've done a couple of imaging studies of brains of progressives versus conservatives. And what they find is the activity in the conservative brains is higher in the amygdala, which is the fear center. And in progressives, it's higher in the cortex and the anterior cingulate, where you do creative decision-making, etc. So the brains really work differently. And fear drives the amygdala. So all these Republicans, they're afraid of terrorists, and they're afraid of being attacked, and they're afraid of what's going to happen. That activates their amygdala, and it makes them susceptible to Republican propaganda.
Mm-hmm. And now we're in a strange place where there is propaganda on both sides. We're in a weird where it's almost created this dichotomy where you have extremes. Instead of becoming central and making compromises and figuring out what makes sense, we're creating extremism. And I think ultimately, that has to collapse back into at least a tighter central ground in order for there to really be some positive changes.
I think a fundamental problem there is money in politics, because on the right, they've got the Koch brothers and all those people saying, you need to vote this way. And if you don't, I'm going to primary you and you're not going to get money. And so, what normal person could go along with destroy the EPA, destroy Health and Human Services, destroy the education system? Even Republicans shouldn't be that radical, but they've got the Koch brothers and DeVos's family and all saying, you better vote for this or we're going to get you.
Yep.
So even in the...
Win at all cost.
Win at all cost, exactly. And, I would hear people talk about radical left-wing liberals, and they would be describing me. And I don't consider myself a radical left-wing liberal. I consider myself a logical, normal person. But the views I have by the mainstream Democratic Party are like, they're liberal. He's a liberal. We'll never have health care for all. We'll never have free college education. Why the hell not? We have free missiles to shoot at Syria. Nobody talks about the cost of those. So I am a liberal.
Yeah. Well, what I really believe is that this is all, the game is consciousness, and the expansion of consciousness creates the ability for people to look with an unbiased lens and see what is for the greatest good. And, while I really liked a lot of what Bernie was talking about, I think the idea that you're going to forcibly take money from the wealthy via taxes and take that and force it into the public domain is less likely. I think anytime you're doing an aggressive act that feels like you're taking someone, people are going to get defensive. They're going to hide their money. They're going to move it. They're going to scuttle it. But you take those same people, you open up their hearts, you open up their mind, you give them access to consciousness. You show them that everyone is them living a different life. You give them a reason to want to give that. And then all of a sudden, all of these hidden pockets of resources and wealth, they can actually channel that into positive good. And I think that's where I'm dedicating my effort is like, all right, yeah, I get the idea. We need wealth to spread to the right reasons, but we need people to want to do that.
Yeah.
And change the consciousness.
But how do you have to change the consciousness of the country, because those people that have all the money, the right-wing people, they really wouldn't want to live in the kind of country that they're working for. Because if people don't have enough money, they don't have health care, you've got sick, angry, hungry people. You don't want to live in that world, but they don't understand. You don't need more money, but what you're creating is a society with two tiers where you're going to be afraid to go outside your gated community because you don't know what's going to happen.
They really want more hugs. They really don't want more money. Like if they were really conscious, they want more hugs. They want people like Caitlin over here to come up and say, hey, thanks so much for contributing. You made such a difference, and give them a warm hug. Like that's what they really want, but they don't know that. So they keep building up bigger houses and more wealth, and they don't really understand, what they're truly desiring on a soul level. Well, let's talk about science.
Okay.
Let's jump in.
Go for it.
So, of all individuals, you are probably, in one of the best positions to give a survey of the clinical research to date that's been done on psilocybin. And psilocybin's a molecule that you're, intimately involved with and understand probably as well as anybody. So let's talk about what has, my audience is familiar with psilocybin, probably in a variety of ways, but if you had to summarize the key clinical findings, from the research that's been going on, what are some of those, landmark studies, and what are some of the things that you're working on now?
So let me tell you why the Heffter focused on psilocybin. And Heffter focusing on is why so many people know about psilocybin.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to do a study, and we didn't have a lot of money. And so we thought, how can we get the most bang for our buck? And so we looked at the old literature, and the thing that seemed to be most successful was the treatment of cancer patients with LSD back at the Spring Grove Hospital. And Groff was involved, and Savage, and Bill Richards. And so we said 60 to 70% of the people got some benefit, some degree of benefit from that. And that was an indication where the risk to benefit ratio seemed really favorable, because they're dying, they're in pain, nothing's really helping them. So we could go in there and everybody would be compassionate. People are dying, they're afraid to die. Helping them seemed like a good thing. So we said, okay, this is what we're going to focus on. And Charlie Grobe was involved first, and he'd been dealing with Rick Doblin at MAPS about possibly using MDMA. But then Charlie Grobe said, I don't want to use MDMA in dying people because their health is bad, and it may further stress them. And MDMA stresses their cardiovascular system, and I just don't want to do it. And so we said, okay. And he backed out of that study. So we said, what would we use? Well, we looked at those old LSD studies, and we said, LSD seemed to work really well. But if we used LSD, there's certain problems. The major problem was we thought we might create a feeding frenzy by the media, because you've seen sort of the media pick up, but we've never talked much about LSD. Oh, they're giving LSD to dying patients. And so we thought the media would be honest, it would be unfavorable, and we really didn't want that. We wanted to stay under the radar screen.
It also has that street name, acid. Which it becomes a marketing and branding problem. And it's a problem for MDMA that fortunately MAPS has found their way through. Ecstasy, like when people want to be sensational, they don't call it MDMA research. They call it, they gave ecstasy to veterans, but with psilocybin, fortunately, I guess they can say magic mushrooms, but they tend not to. They tend to talk about psilocybin because that's actually the compound that you isolated.
Well, we had the problem. We feared we'd have a media feeding frenzy. And in those studies in the 60s, there were patients who desperately needed some kind of a relief. And when they found out they were going to get LSD, they backed out. There were some patients that, no, I've heard about that. It makes you crazy. I don't want to take it. And also, LSD lasts 8 to 10 hours. So if you have a session with someone, they come in at 9 o'clock, you're going to be there all day. It's going to be a commitment by the therapist for a long period of time. So what else could we use? Well, DMT is too short acting. We didn't think that would really work. And you'd have to make them smoke it or inject it. Mescaline, which is in peyote, that's safe, but the dose is high, and a lot of people, when they take mescaline or peyote, they get sick, they get nauseous. We thought, you don't want to make them sick and nauseous. And it also lasts 8 to 10 hours.
Yep.
Okay, well, psilocybin. Well, magic mushrooms, the Aztecs used it. Teonanacatl, flesh of the gods. People have used it worldwide, millions and millions of people, no adverse effects, no deaths. So this sounds good. Let's use psilocybin. And when we started this work, if you went up to the guy on the street and said, well, we're using psilocybin, he'd go, what? And then I'd say, did you ever hear of magic mushrooms or shrooms? Oh, yeah, back when I was in college. It was the active ingredient in psilocybin. Nobody knew what psilocybin was except a few. And now, of course, a lot of people do because, oh, yeah, psilocybin. So, and it's short acting, 4 to 6 hours. So they come in at 9. The session is done late in the afternoon. They can go home with, someone brought them. So, but we didn't know if it would work. So we thought, okay, LSD worked, but we don't know if psilocybin will work. So then Charlie did the first study. It was Charlie Grobe at UCLA. And the dose was probably too low. And he didn't really have the ideal setting, but it worked. He got trends that were positive, and at 6 months, significantly positive reduction. So we thought, okay, this is going to work.
And that was depression right off the gate?
Yeah. Anxiety and depression in cancer patients. And they were severely ill. So then Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins decided to sort of pick up the same thing and start doing it. And so then we had that, and then New York University. So the psilocybin story got started that way. And it was really a choice to use that as opposed to other possible psychedelics, partly for political reasons, but also sort of logistics, the length of time and the possibility of making people feel bad with mescaline. And so that's kind of the psilocybin story, how it got started, the modern story.
Yeah, and now, as we've shown with a lot of this research, it may just be the perfect molecule to have chosen for a variety of reasons, because the preponderance of evidence that's coming out now is really overwhelming. It's almost a problem of there's so many indications that this is showing benefit for. What do we choose next?
Right. Yeah. We've got an OCD study that's just going to start, I think, beginning of the summer. I want to do an eating disorder study because there is some anecdotal evidence of people who have taken LSD and the eating disorder disappeared. And that, of course, is the most lethal psychiatric disorder. More people die, percentage-wise, of eating disorders. There's a woman at UNC Chapel Hill, Kathy Bulick, who's an expert in eating disorders, and I listened to an interview with her, and she said, we don't even know how many young women this disorder kills, because a lot of times after they die, the medical report will be they died of cardiac arrest. It won't say secondary to extreme wasting.
Yeah, right.
And so there's a condition that's very difficult to treat and highly fatal. A large percentage of patients just die. Nobody knows what to do. So imagine someone who's wasting away and basically going to die if you don't do something, and you do this session and all of a sudden they're back. They, get a different perspective. They don't see themselves as fat and obese and whatever's happened. And it's on the continuum of that compulsive, OCD, eating disorders. They're all on a kind of continuum.
From everything that I know about psilocybin, and from both the clinical perspective, looking at the research, the mechanism of action that I'm excited to talk to you about so I get a deeper understanding of in personal use, I can't see how it would not have a significant impact in eating disorders. It seems like an ideal candidate to test.
I agree. It has to be done, and we have to raise the money to do that. But there are people that want to do an eating disorder study. So I think that'll be one of the things we do, and that'll be coming up soon. The OCD study, there was a study published from Scandinavian psychiatrist named Vandrup and Vanguard back in the 70s, and it was a 10-year follow-up of an individual that had severe obsessive compulsive disorder. And he had become completely incapacitated. They say if he heard a toilet flush, he'd have to go wash his hands a dozen times. He'd use 4 or 5 rolls of toilet paper a day. He was such a fear of contamination that he couldn't work. He was in his house.
Maybe he just had a really messy butt. Well, people look at that. He needed some wet wipes in his life. Can someone give him a dude wipe sponsorship, please?
Anyway, the psychiatrist gave him a dose of LSD every month for like 15 months. No therapy. He just had a psychiatric nurse that sat with him. And this report was a 10-year follow-up. And over the course of those periodic LSD doses, he became completely symptom-free. He got his job back. He moved up in the company. People who had known him his whole life said his personality, he's so much better than he ever was. He's just a different person. And they reported this as a 10-year follow-up, LSD with no psychotherapy.
Yeah.
So I have a copy of that. I still remember, boy, this is such an amazing thing. He even remembered, they remarked in there that he had no training in psychology or Freudian terminology or anything. And he started talking about his early toilet training and things like that.
Wow.
And they said he even remembered when his symptoms started. He got off a bus late at night and stepped in a pile of dog doo. And that was when his symptoms started.
So that traumatic event
somehow triggered this whole thing.
Interesting.
So I think OCD will work. We sponsored a study at University of Arizona. That was one of the first studies we did with Francisco Marino, but the study was poorly designed, but he had anecdotal evidence from people who ate magic mushrooms that they had lost their symptoms while the mushrooms had their effect. So he actually saw that, but we didn't have long term. And that study needs to be replicated. But I think OCD will work. I think eating disorders will probably work. Maybe not for 100%, but if you could do 80%.
Yeah. So then, we were talking earlier, there's a 180-person alcohol addiction study that's underway at NYU.
New York University, yeah.
And early indications, have there been any pilot studies done prior to that?
Yeah. So Michael Bogenschutz did a pilot study when he was still at the University of New Mexico. I think it was maybe 10 subjects, a pilot study, and showed a significant reduction in drinking days and heavy drinking days. So that was what allowed this expanded study. So the pilot study indicated that it did work in that small cohort. So now they're doing a larger study. So then we'll get really good numbers. Does it work? How many people does it work in, and maybe improve the sort of diagnosis for who does it work for and how well. But yeah, that was what allowed us to, that's a big investment to do a study like that.
Yeah.
I think we calculated for most of these studies, it's about $25,000 per participant. So imagine, what 190 participants cost. Yep. And so we sort of pay as you go on these things. But, alcoholism is such a terrible disease.
Sure.
And I think...
because it not only affects the person who has it, it affects the people around them.
Your family, your neighbors, everybody.
A random stranger as you're driving a car drunk, And I
think at lunch they told you Michael had sent a grant in to one of the agencies to get money to pay for scanning, brain scanning, to do functional MRI scanning before and after all these patients, so we could see what's changed in the way the brain functions after they're treated and healed. He sent this grant in, and the study section gave him the highest possible ranking. They were enthusiastic and said, this work really needs to be done. If this works, we need to understand what's happening in the brain. So he got this score, and he was talking to his project officer, and he said, so this is going to be funded. And, funding from NIH is hard to get. So if you get a top score, you think you're going to get the money. And she said, well, no, it's actually not. And he said, what? And why not? Well, the division director isn't going to do this. And so we had a dialogue with him and said, we'll send the division director an email and say, we're looking for novel treatments for alcoholism. This could be a tremendous health benefit for public health. So I saw the email the division director sent back. He said, we will not under any circumstances ever approve the use of a hallucinogen to treat a condition.
It's a really scientific response he gave.
And he said,
non-emotional, unbiased, just looking at the data.
And he added, if I had known that this was what it was about, I would have told you, don't even apply. And it wasn't to do the study. It was to do this before and after scanning. It was 2 years, $125,000. So it was like, gee, my gosh. And the only reason you can understand why he might have done that is he was afraid that some congressman would see that this institute was funding a study that involved giving a psychedelic in a treatment program. But it just shows how recalcitrant and how backwards some of those people are in the top. And they're afraid of the politics. He obviously was afraid that somebody found out he'd lose his job or whatever. But I actually don't know what he was thinking, but you have to imagine it.
Yeah.
So
certainly some kind of bias or internal bias or self-interest or part of some larger political mechanism.
Right. I mean, there's no logic to what he said or did. And this, with the nicotine addiction study that Matt Johnson did at Johns Hopkins, he treated those 15 subjects and got 80% of them had quit smoking. And then I think he's done a follow-up, and after time, it's down to 61%, I think, are still abstinent. But with Chantix, which is supposed to be the best therapy, Chantix with the program of therapy, the best you ever get is 35% of people stopping.
So just twice as good.
Twice as good.
And that's the things that we're seeing across the board. We're not seeing like marginal improvements. No. We're seeing dramatic, paradigm-shattering treatments that are coming out here. I mean, this is so. Let's talk about the big ones that are there. There's, we're preparing for phase 3 trials for major depression, and the indications have been so far that there is a dramatic impact on patients with depression.
Right. Chuck Raison, who you met earlier, he's at University of Wisconsin now. He was at one of the early meetings where they presented some of these data in depression. And he sat in the audience, and he had done depression research, so he was aware of the significance of that. I hadn't done depression research, but I knew the numbers looked really good. And it goes from 25, it drops down to 6 or something on this one scale. And he says, my God, that's amazing. There's nothing that works like that, which is true. Yep. There's nothing that works like that. If you were a drug company and you were trying to treat depression and you developed another Me Too SSRI, and that's what they do. It's incremental changes. They say, well, we've got this new one and maybe it's tolerated better, or maybe it's a little faster onset or whatever. But you never see numbers like that. You do a comparator and they compare it to placebo. Give them nothing. And if it's better than nothing, okay, then we showed efficacy. They don't compare it to something that's already out there because it won't be any better.
Yep.
This is just amazing results. And with the nicotine studies, there's a fellow at NIDA that saw the numbers from Matt Johnson's study, this 80% reduction of smoking. He said the same thing. There's nothing that works like this. And actually, he volunteered to do brain scanning studies on those subjects. So Matt's study is being expanded now, I think, to 40 participants. And he's going to do before and after brain scanning to find out what's happened in the functioning of the brain to make those people stop. What's changed in the way their brains operate.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about study design, and then we'll go into mechanism of action, because one of the curious things for myself and for other people who've experienced psilocybin is, how do you get a placebo?
Yeah.
How do you do that? Because
that's a perennial problem.
Yeah.
Well, in the alcoholism study, Mike Bogenschutz uses a large dose of Benadryl, which makes people feel kind of woozy, and it does more, and it's a big dose. It's more than you would take for hay fever.
Right.
The New York University study used niacin. Niacin makes your skin flush and tingly, so you've been given something.
Yeah.
If you've never had a psychedelic, maybe you'd think, okay, this could be.
Sure. But if you've had a lot of niacin and a lot of psilocybin, I can tell, God darn it, I got the niacin again. My ass is on fire. My face is itchy. This is not what I was hoping for here. This is not going to give me one of my top 5 life experiences, for sure.
And Roland Griffiths is a master of designing placebos. And in his 2006 study, he actually used methylphenidate Ritalin, I believe, at a fairly high dose. But the guides, he had them all confused because there were like 5 different drugs that people could be given, including psilocybin. And so the guides couldn't even figure out a lot of time, like, what did this person get?
Which is what you want.
Yeah, exactly what you want. But in the depression, in the cancer patients, he used a low dose of psilocybin that was basically inactive, presumably inactive. We don't know whether it was inactive, but it was a dose they couldn't detect as was psychoactive. So then he could tell all the subjects, every session you're going to get a dose of psilocybin. And so it was a way to kind of couch it. But, if they get the real McCoy, you kind of know.
Yeah.
In the study that's running now at University of Alabama that Peter Hendricks is running in cocaine addicts, I spoke to him after, I think, 4 subjects have been enrolled. It's also double-blind, placebo-controlled, and he had, I think, 4 subjects. And I said, can you tell anything? He said, well, I know it's placebo-controlled and it's blinded, but he said, there's some amazing things. And he talked about one woman that was a hardcore cocaine addict, I think a crack addict, and he said, she got into, after the session, her mood completely changed. She got into social services. She started getting subsidized housing and was starting to put her life back together, and told him, you saved my life. So it probably wasn't placebo.
Probably not.
But no, you're right. I mean, the high dose where people have the mystical transcendental experience, it would be real hard to miss that.
Yeah. Well, and I guess the challenge with the low dose of psilocybin is some of the indications from the microdosing, just very preliminary, it's a lot of it anecdotal at this point, is that may be a more active placebo than we're even realizing.
Yeah. If you look at the paper he published on that, there's the group that got the high dose first and the group that got the low dose first. And the low dose group does have some improvement in symptoms. You don't know whether it was the therapy. It could have just been the effect of the therapy because, they do therapy for several hours before they get the drug. It could have been just the therapy, but there could be that there was some antidepressant effect in the low dose. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. So cocaine was another study. What are the other studies and there's also some psychospiritual studies, but that have shown some benefit with psilocybin. But what are the other kind of medically and focused studies that are out there? Is there any more that we kind of missed on the table here?
Well, there's a study of cluster headache that's going on, and that's a young new investigator, Emmanuel Schindler, is basically doing that study. We think that should work. There's evidence that psilocybin and LSD work to abort and prevent cluster headaches.
And that's like a migraine from hell? I mean, what is a cluster headache?
Yeah, it's the migraine from hell tenfold.
Wow.
I mean, there is no good way to abort that. People will take oxygen tanks and try to breathe it to try to make it stop, but it feels like somebody's driving a spike through your head. I mean, they're apparently really agonizing.
Wow.
And I don't know what the patient population size is, but if you can abort it and it doesn't happen, these people, I mean, this would be a tremendous advance for them. So that's ongoing. The obsessive compulsive disorder study is going to start. I think I talked to him, early June, May or June. That's going to start. They're small pilot studies. does it work in a small pilot study with using the same techniques? And then if it works, then of course what we do is want to expand it. So I don't know what his enrollment is in the OCD study, but it's probably not more than a dozen or so. But then if it works, what you want to do is say, okay, let's power it up, do a larger study and see what the numbers really are and what the long term is. Mm-hmm. So OCD, cluster headache, cocaine addiction, and we should be getting an update on how far he is there. The cocaine study would be 40 cocaine addicts, and again, placebo controlled. And I think there may be an open label arm that if they get the placebo, then they can come back and get the drug. So a lot of these where you have the placebo versus active drug, and the active drug works, and a lot of them, they'll have an arm where they can get open label after the study's over and give them the real drug, and so that you don't deprive them of therapy.
Yeah. Any opioid studies with psilocybin, or is that relegated to ibogaine at this point?
I've heard rumblings of people that want to maybe look at opioid addiction and psilocybin, but ibogaine's a different mechanism. We don't know how ibogaine actually works.
It seems like it's a compound mechanism of action. Like there's multiple different mechanisms.
It's not a classic hallucinogen in terms of its mechanism of action. Nobody has really elucidated what it does. But of course, people that have been heroin addicts that have gone through it and they have no craving, they swear by it. So
I watched it happen. I was down in Costa Rica and I saw someone come in hollow-eyed, lost, disconnected from any kind of personal communication. And I watched him go through a harrowing, 4-day, he was there kind of the whole time I was, and a 4-day recovery process. We're out of the end of that. You were looking at a totally new human being, and he's stayed on to volunteer and help. And, I've heard that he's still completely clean on it. It's remarkable when you see it happen that fast. Someone comes in one way and then really a true single dose. I think they maybe did 2 doses, but a harrowing 4-day hellish process. But at the end of it, you have lasting change.
And the trick with addiction studies and people like that is, can they potentially be high functioning to begin with? Because if you get somebody off the street who's homeless and addicted, he doesn't have the money to fly to a clinic anyway. But if he had the money to go to the clinic and he no longer needs the drug, then what does he go back to? Living under the bridge.
Yeah.
So the people that have been getting it so far have had the resources to be able to follow up and rebuild their lives. So that's a key part of it too.
Yeah. So let's talk mechanism of action. I mean, we've talked about all of these different indications, and we haven't even gotten into the psychospiritual indications. But we'll have an opportunity to talk about that with some of the other guests that are coming on. But how does one molecule account for so many changes?
So that's a question I presented in a recent review that I wrote with my son, with Matt Johnson, published in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. So I said, okay, works in depression, works in anxiety, works in alcohol addiction, maybe works in all these other things. The traditional notions of how drugs work, the traditional pharmacotherapy, I use the analogy, it's like you have an electronic circuit that's malfunctioning and you don't understand what's wrong with it. So you take out a resistor and replace it. You take out this transistor, you replace it, and you keep replacing components until it starts working again. That's the conventional approach to treating things like depression and anxiety. You give an SSRI, well, let's raise the serotonin level in the synapse. Well, that didn't really work. Let's give a mixed one, an SNRI that raises serotonin and norepinephrine levels. Well, that doesn't work. You try another one. It takes 3 or 4 weeks to start. So it's kind of empirically based. Somebody's got anxiety. Okay, is it long term? Let's put them on lorazepam. Well, let's combine it with something else. Let's combine it with FNF. So it's kind of a hit or miss, but it's all focused on receptor-based pharmacotherapy. And that doesn't work with a psychedelic, because how does one receptor do all that? So that was the question that we presented. So that begs this question, how does it work? So we know from Robin Card-Harris's work at Imperial College that you see these changes in functional connectivity, resting state functional connectivity. So what happens is psychedelics activate serotonin 2A receptors. Mm-hmm. Now, in serotonin 2A receptors are on these cortical pyramidal cells, which are like the central processing units all throughout the cortex. So all your information comes in, is integrated in these cells, and then they send signals back, and that's your executive function, making decisions, whatever. So they're like the key elements in the cortex. So the serotonin 2A receptor it depolarizes them. So there's a membrane potential across the neurons where you have a charge separation. So those receptors, when you activate them, that charge separation decreases. So the membrane potential rides toward a point where it would want to fire the neuron, but it doesn't fire. It just makes them more sensitive. It turns up the gain. Mm-hmm. So they're all turned on. Well, then there's another area in the brain called the colostrum, and this is what we proposed. So Francis Crick, before he died, and Christopher Kalk, who's a big consciousness guy at the Paul Allen Brain Institute, published a paper in 2005, said the colostrum, the seat of consciousness, or something to that effect.
Sure.
The colostrum is this kind of enigmatic area that's in between the cortex and the insula. It's a little thin layer of cells. It turns out that the colostrum is highly connected. It's the most highly connected area in the whole brain. It connects to all the parts of the brain. It also turns out that the colostrum has the highest expression density of serotonin 2A receptors in the entire brain. And it also turns out that the cells in the colostrum don't just become sensitized and depolarized, they actually generate action potentials. And when they generate an action potential, they fire the neurons and they send glutamate to the whole brain, to all these places they're connected to. Now, the way that neurons fire, you know what an avalanche is, right? Mm-hmm. So neurons fire in the brain in what are called neuronal avalanches. So you have all these neurons connected together in like big chains of neurons, and one neuron fires a signal, and maybe it activates 2 or 3 other neurons. And they may be activated or it may fade out. It depends on whether they're sensitive and how much of a signal they get. So you can have amplifying neuronal avalanches. So if all these neurons are sensitized, you pop one at the top and it fires, and it'll create this whole avalanche of neurons firing. So what we think, this is our best guess at this point, this is speculation. Our best guess is all these neurons are sensitized now by being activated through these serotonin 2A receptors. The colostrum actually fires and sends out glutamate projections and starts stimulating all these cells, and they just start firing like crazy. And so that creates this increase in connectivity. So the individual modules that were connected to each other before and talking to each other, that all breaks down because they're kind of overexcited and they all start talking to each other. So you have this massive connectivity all throughout the brain. So what happens? Then something happens, right? That's the big question. But what we think is when all that wears off, some changes have happened in neuroadaptation and long-term potentiation, whatever. But when that all wears off, the drug leaves the brain again. It sort of resets and goes back to the healthy connectivity state they had before. And they've done studies. This resting state functional connectivity is something they do now using a functional MRI. And they can actually look at whether two areas in the brain talk to each other. It's a statistical correlation. You don't know which one is talking to which one, but you know that when this one lights up, this one lights up. So they've shown now for virtually every psychiatric disorder that resting state functional connectivity is dysfunctional. Mm. And in one study, at least, that I looked at, they had people who were depressed. And so they did this resting state functional connectivity, looked at the way the brain was talking, communicating. They gave them a standard SSRI, and then for the patients who were no longer depressed, they ran functional connectivity brain scanning studies again, and the patterns were healthy. So somehow what I think happens is you have these dysfunctional connectivity in the brain, and through this process of connectivity, excitability, whatever, you change that so that when the drug leaves the brain, it falls back into a more healthy functional connectivity pattern. And that's the big question. That's what's really interesting, because when somebody's healed by this, like, how did that happen?
It almost brings me back to the conversation we were having at the start, where if you think of the brain like different houses in a community, mm-hmm. right? And those houses are full of fear and full of trauma and whatever. They're going to have guard dogs and fences and alarms, and they're not going to talk to anybody. And maybe there's that house, the colostrum of pretty conscious individuals, right? The highest thinking individuals, but nobody's communicating with those people. They're just isolating themselves, piping in the information that fits with their own bias. And then, you have something that universally opens up communication where everybody starts talking to each other, and then passing information back and forth, and the whole community then starts to become more conscious through that process. And in some ways, it's like the brain, all of these elements in the process of communication, opening up those channels, seems to operate and function in a more healthy way. Does that make sense in any regard?
We don't. Not enough is known about this functional connectivity and efficient connectivity to really understand what's going on. But you do have these little identified segregated modules, like you say, like a house. And most of the communication is within the house. They're just talking within the house. It's intra-house. And then what happens is those barriers between these modules are broken down. And then they can start talking to their neighbors, and then they talk all across the brain. So you kind of let the rabid dog out of the house, so to speak.
That's beautiful. Now, what I've heard before, that psilocybin shunts blood to the default mode network. Is that a kind of a false attribution of a mechanism of action? I mean, I think that was something that maybe even Amanda Fielding was saying, or
the work at Imperial College was looking at decreased energy in the default network and decreased blood flow. And there was some contradiction because the stuff that Franz Vollenweider had published years earlier, where he used PET imaging, had shown that there was activation of the prefrontal cortex. In the work that Carhart Harris did, they showed deactivation. And so there was kind of what is it? Now, Franz has gone back and very carefully controlled for all kinds of artifacts, blood flow artifacts, etc. So it looks like the prefrontal cortex is activated, but the default mode network is this area that's active when you're not doing anything. And they actually discovered it that way. When people are just sitting and resting and not doing anything, maybe just daydreaming or whatever, they were looking at the energy use in the brain, and there was these areas that they called the default mode network that were using a lot of energy. And they said, what are they using all this energy for? Because nobody's doing anything. They're just sitting there kind of daydreaming.
Vegging out.
And that's the default mode network. So when its energy goes down there, then it expands. So you have expansion to task positive networks and so forth. So there's a whole change in the way the brain is connected.
Yeah, but again, it can also be looked at in this connectivity description that.
Yeah, and so then they follow that up with connectivity, and so and that's what. Basically, functional connectivity is what everybody's starting to do now. They realize this is a powerful way to look at what happens in the brain. And then also, the same group at Imperial College uses magnetoencephalography to look at the actual currents, and they see the same thing, the changes in the way the brain connects. But that's like the big problem. That's the big question, the big research question, to understand what happens there. Robin gave a talk. I was in Copenhagen. We gave a talk at the same symposium. And when he finished, he talked about the study where they treated the 12 severely depressed patients with 2 doses of psilocybin, and the depression went away. And David Nutt may have talked about that here too. And somebody said, how does that work? And he was ready. He had a slide. He put up this slide that had a big shiny red button on it with white letters that said reset. He says, I think you push it. And I used to tell people, they'd ask me how it works. I said, I think it's like rebooting the computer. Yeah. It gets sloggy. You hit Control-Alt-Delete, and you get rid of all the stuff that's running in the background that's clogging the system up. That's kind of a crude analogy. And that understanding what that really represents and how those changes occur is going to be a huge breakthrough in terms of understanding brain function, disease, and everything, I think.
Yeah, totally. And so from someone who hasn't come from a scientific perspective, but has used psilocybin to make dramatic positive impacts on my own, because I think we all carry anxieties, depressions, addictions to certain levels, maybe not in a clinical pathological level that we need to get measured, but we all have this stuff that we carry around. And for myself, psilocybin has been one of those things that is immensely helped with a variety of different conditions, and continues to be an ally for me. And for me, what it feels like is that there's problems associated with the ego self, the self that is involved in identity, and the Aubrey Marcus self. And then there's this other self, which I can only call consciousness, a self that has no identity, seems to exist primarily in the present moment, doesn't have these issues. And psilocybin and some of these other plant medicines seem to activate and elevate, or perhaps even diminish the egoic self. One way or another, the priority gets shifted to that element of consciousness, that element of presence, where you feel unified, whole, and in a different state of being. And then all of these problems generated by the self, the storage of trauma, the memory, the identity of who you are, all of these factors then start to disappear. It's like there's all these fires that you could try to put out as the self, and apply this pill here and try and stop that fire, and apply this pill and chase all these fires. Or you can just change your attention point, change your identity as self, and then all of the fires start to go out on their own in kind of a magical way. And that's the experience that I've had. And it's cool because obviously we've known enough now that nothing works in isolation. There's these the feelings that you can have, but then what's actually happening in the brain, everything is correlated. I mean, that's the beauty of this existence. You have that kind of like the materialist reductionist approach of like, what is the nitty gritty that's happening? And then what does it feel like, at the other side? And I think, both of those coincide. And perhaps in the most conscious state, that thing that I'm talking about as consciousness, it is where the brain is communicating in a whole unified, unicity, where everything else feels segmented. I'm watching this part, I'm judging this part, I'm thinking about this part. You feel almost fragmented, and then you expand and enhance communication through something like psilocybin, and it feels like consciousness. It feels like the bliss of the now, and that information it's a game changer.
Well, what Robin Card-Harris has said about the default mode network is its disintegration corresponds to the level of ego disintegration. And he said this default mode network may be kind of the ego. That's the part that structures, sort of who you are. And when it collapses, when you destroy it and the connectivity, then it expands out. And so these other parts of the brain get involved that maybe are more enlightened or whatever you want to.
Yeah.
And something like that. So you've actually kind of destroyed the part of your brain that's keeps that ego intact. The structure disappears, and then everything starts communicating. So literally, their mind expanding. It's what people always said. They produce mind expansion. You're using more of your mind because you're getting connections between areas of the brain. Another thing they found that's related to that was with LSD, the visual cortex in the back of the brain expands out and starts contacting and communicating with areas it normally doesn't communicate with.
Yeah.
So
that's, so what does this world look like in, what are the game-changing implications of this? I mean, have you allowed yourself the fantasy to be able to look forward into the future where psilocybin is an approved drug for depression, and you have all of these backup studies showing efficacy in addictions and OCD? And what does that world look like to you? Is that something that drives you? Is that something that motivates your research?
Yeah, it will revolutionize psychiatry. Psychiatry, you may know, is one of the most conservative areas of medicine. And I taught medical students, and occasionally I would say, what specialties are going to go into? And, a couple people would say OBGYN, and somebody else would say, internal medicine, and somebody else would say, I want to be cardiovascular. No hand. I said, how many people want to go into psychiatry? No hands. I think 3 years, and I asked that, maybe one person said they want to go to psychiatry. The reason is psychiatry just doesn't have medicines. They don't have things that work. And this will revolutionize psychiatry. When I wrote that review article, the title was Psychedelics as Medicines, an Emerging New Paradigm. I think it will revolutionize psychiatry. So once you understand what's happening to produce these long-term beneficial effects, you're going to understand more about the basis for those disorders to begin with. If depression relates to a certain type of dysfunctional connectivity, what are the areas of the brain that have contributed to that? Can we find them and find out, well, what drives them? What are the things that drive them? So I think for a long time in the future, for many, many years, we're going to be just looking at the details of how that actually works out. But if you eventually get it all worked out, you're also at the same time going to be learning a lot about consciousness itself. Mm-hmm. And the big question as a kid, I always, I used to lay out on the grass, look up the sky, and I'd think, I didn't really have a happy childhood, let me say that. And I would look out the sky and I would think, what are we doing here? Who am I? I would actually think things like that. And that's a question, generations ago, it was okay to be a philosopher. You didn't have to make a lot of money. But people quit asking that question. And, if you take time to think about it, especially people who've used psychedelics, you sit down and a lot of times the discussion goes to like, what are we doing here? What do you think we're here for? What's our purpose in life? And ordinary people that sit around and drink beer, and they never talk like that.
Yeah.
But I think that's something that's a basic core question that a lot of people wonder about. What's our motivation? Why are we here? Are we born and do we die? And then people get into questions about, is there spirit, or is it, is there not spirit, do you believe in God? All these things of questions that make us human, and questions that everybody wonders about. I think we'll actually start talking about some of those things, like what is consciousness? How is it structured?
And you see it happening already.
Yeah.
You see these conversations coming to the forefront. And I think the psychedelic, this second psychedelic renaissance has been a key part of that as well. And it's also, what you guys are doing on the scientific front is absolutely essential to this whole process. It's the only way that we could take psychedelics out of this draconian dark age model and bring light to what the actual benefits are. Because, and I think as soon as the scientific method was allowed to work, the wheels were already in place to a foregone conclusion. And it's just about timing to get there, because it's too powerful a tool to deny when you allow the scientific process, to take hold. And that's the beauty of where you guys have been focused. Just focus on that. Focus on things that aren't disputable, that aren't subjective. This is objective data that we now have. Okay, here's the safety studies. All of these things that you might have heard. Well, here's the actual results. Okay, it's beneficial. You've heard that. Okay, here's some actual results. And that's an undeniable process. And it's just a matter of getting the attention and getting, we're still going to run into resistance from individuals like that guy at the NIH that says, I absolutely won't work on psilocybin, but they're on the wrong side of the fence and on the wrong side of history. And, I think people will start to see the trend, and, nobody ultimately, even the staunchest ego, doesn't want to be on the wrong side of history. And so that'll start to turn.
Well, look at just the excitement in the media and the general public about this issue. Why should people in general be interested in psychedelics? And yet you see they really are. And they see this as so there's a basic curiosity. And, I think the medical model, people have questioned me, why, you think only doctors should be able to give these and so forth. And why can't people use them for spiritual growth and whatever? I say, that's a whole nother debate. But I have focused on the medical model because I see that as the way we can get through, do the science, like you say, get the data. People said, well, what about Trump? Is he going to affect you? I said, the FDA is supposed to be impervious to politics. They work on data. We're presenting data. We're showing these things work. But I think it will change once public perception changes. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how long that'll take. People asked me years ago, what do you see as the future? And I said, well, someday in the future, probably long after I'm dead, somebody will be having a midlife crisis, and their doctor will send them down to see the psychiatrist/shaman, and he'll give them a session with a psychedelic, and he'll get a perspective on his life, where he's going, where he's been, and kind of get things back in focus. And they said, you think you'll be dead? That's really depressing. How can... I said, well, you have to start somewhere. And we're a lot farther than I thought we would be. And I hope in another 10 years I'm still around to watch it, because I think we're just seeing, the bud is just starting to kind of open up, and we're going to see this thing really start to bloom. The possibilities, for treatment, and, maybe it will come to spiritual stuff. I used to tell people a church that used psilocybin as a sacrament would become the fastest growing church in the world. And
no doubt.
Anybody who would use it would say, yeah.
Yeah. And then there's been, studies to that effect on that psychospiritual side too, and even weaving science into some of the work that's been done at Johns Hopkins. They have these things to point to. Some of the most significant life experiences for people are when they receive this psilocybin treatment.
How can taking psilocybin be as important as falling in love for the first time? But it is for some people.
Well, that vision of the future, even, it made me even a little emotional to think, because it's a symbol of a world that has shifted dramatically, where someone who's in pain and suffering has a real, caring, positive option that can cause lasting change. And it's so sad right now, because, you can see people in so much pain and so much suffering with so few options and so few good options. And then there's these things that are just right there, like, almost across the finish line, but we have all this momentum and residue from past ideas and misinformation and fears and the ego desperately clinging to the system as it was. But we're headed that way. We just gotta survive the perils, the Scillas and Charybdis of the world, and make it there, because the allies are coming. We have help for humanity on the way. So just fucking hold the ground. It's like the good forces, the hobbits and Gandalf and the elves in Middle Earth, and the horde is at the gates. But Gandalf and the mushrooms are coming, coming over the ridge, and someday they'll be holding the staff. And
and think about people at the end of life, how terrifying that is for some people. We don't deal with death well at all.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the videos posted on Heffter website of people that have been through this treatment that were dying, they became isolated, withdrawn. They pushed their friends away, basically just lost contact. They wanted to be left alone to die, in a sense. And then after the treatment, it's all like sudden, like they got their life back. They wanted to see their family again and reconnected. And the life they had at the end was, the quality improved so much, and they weren't afraid to die.
Yeah.
And to be able to see that, like, I can do this now. I'm not afraid anymore. The fear is gone. It's marvelous. For any of these, depression or anything, just to be able to take that away with a single treatment of a specific type of drug. And they're illegal.
I know. And not only illegal, but Schedule 1, which makes it
very
the most illegal. Let's just not put it barely over the line of illegal. Let's push it all the way to really illegal. That makes a lot of sense.
It's as illegal as it could get.
just so we know we're dealing in an absurdity. Let's just make sure that we understand
it's a sort of absurd conversation that I heard years ago from some friends who had taken magic mushrooms, and they were all sitting around talking about what is the universe and do we live after we die and everything. And someone said, do you realize that we're all committing felonies here by eating these mushrooms?
Right.
And it was so absurd.
And the punishment for that action would be thrown in a cage where your humanity is shredded from you. Like, that makes a lot of sense. We'll look back at this time as we look at some of the atrocities of our past, as we look at slavery and we look at, women's suffrage movement and all these things, say, wow, we were really dumb then.
Why did it take so long to realize how important these were,
Exactly. We'll look at that. Well, it's a beautiful world, and, it's just so grateful that you've dedicated your life and your time to bringing these things to the forefront. It's something that will, in my opinion, have one of the most dramatic impacts on the shape of humanity. So, from my heart, thank you.
It's I get to leave something behind when I pass from this world.
No doubt. Thanks, everybody. And please, if you have resources and you have anything that you feel compelled to give, definitely check out what Heffter is doing. As I said, all this money is getting put to really good use. So I guess probably go to the website.
Yeah, and we have people can do PayPal or they can contact us directly. Money is the choke point. And basically, we're trying to identify young scientists. There's a lot of young guys out there. I get emails all the time. They want to know, how can I get involved in this work? And really, money is the problem. Investigators at big universities will do these studies if they can get funded. They can't get funded by the government.
Yeah.
But their job's in jeopardy if they don't have money for their research. And so all these studies, if there's funding, we can get young investigators involved, and then they'll become senior investigators, and it'll be a snowball effect. So
beautiful. Let's make it happen.
Indeed.
Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, for sure. Goodbye, everybody.